Lebanon's Prime Minister is back in Beirut, but he's backpedaled on his resignation. Will his return and his apparent change of heart ease political tensions, or will it only worsen regional rivalries? I'm Imran Gabda, and today's newsmaker is Saad Hariri. The last few weeks have played out like a political thriller. First, the Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri sensationally stepped down, saying his life was in danger. But the president of Lebanon rejected his resignation, dismissing it as having been orchestrated by Saudi Arabia. Then it was thought Hariri was being held in Riyadh against his will, but both he and the Saudis denied it. As the region was plunging into political chaos, Lebanon's former colonial power, France, jumped in. President Emmanuel Macron invited Hariri to Paris, where he assured his people he would return soon. And at long last, Hariri was back in Beirut. And in a surprise twist, he deferred his resignation. So what impact will his homecoming have on the region? Basil Rehan takes a look.
This was Prime Minister Saad Hariri's highly anticipated return to Lebanon. Right on time for Independence Day celebrations. His mysterious two-week absence inspired a raft of conspiracy theories. Many Lebanese hope he'll now be able to put that speculation to rest. The reality so far is the story is getting more confusing.
I discussed today my resignation with the President of the Republic, who asked me to wait before submitting it and to put it on hold and allow for more consultations into the reasons behind it. I have accepted this request.
2 weeks ago, Saad Hariri disappeared, turned up in Riyadh, and then resigned as Lebanon's Prime Minister on live Saudi television. He said his life was in danger in Lebanon. The bizarre series of events captivated and confused audiences worldwide. More importantly, it ignited a political firestorm in Lebanon.
Our Prime Minister has been detained and arrested in Saudi Arabia.
It's clear the resignation was a Saudi decision imposed on the Prime Minister.
Lebanon's President, Michel Aoun, had refused to accept Hariri's resignation while he was still out of the country. It appears Aoun has been able to convince the Prime Minister to see things his way, at least for now. But as Hariri settles back in at home, the question on many minds is whether the drama of the past 2 weeks is over, and whether the current compromise will hold.
We are against Hezbollah's terrorism. We are against Hezbollah's involvement in the affairs of other countries. And we believe that Lebanon will not see peace and security until and unless Hezbollah disarms.
Lebanon's fortunes, for better or worse, have long been tied to its powerful neighbors. Saudi Arabia holds sway over Lebanon's economy and domestic politics. Hariri is under intense pressure from the Gulf Kingdom to curb the power of Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran. Hariri has echoed Saudi demands that Hezbollah's military wing disarm and pull out of conflicts in Syria and Iraq. He also needs to work with Hezbollah's legitimately elected officials in parliament. With the help of international mediators, there are signs of progress. Nevertheless, the political tightrope between Saudi Arabia and Iran is a difficult one to negotiate. Stepping off it is what many people believe led to Lebanon's current crisis. With the regional power struggle heating up, Lebanon's neighbors will be watching its next moves closely. The question is, what will they do when they see something they don't like? Basil Rehan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Beirut by Bassem Shab. He's a member of the Lebanese parliament with Saad Hariri's Future Movement Party. We also have Middle East political commentator Halim Shibaya. And completing our panel is Noor Samaha. She's a journalist with a special focus on Lebanon and the region. I thank you all for joining us. Bassem Shab, what happened? Why the change of heart for the Prime Minister?
Well, it was not a change of heart for the minister only. Yesterday was Lebanon's Independence Day. It was a day of national unity. All political parties yesterday exhibited a will to cooperate, a will to engage in dialogue. And based on that, there was a a move from the Prime Minister and the President, who have worked very well together in the past, to find a solution out of this impasse of the resignation, in which the resignation is temporarily suspended, which will permit the government to work normally and proceed with matters that are important for the Lebanese people and the economy, and at the same time address the issues that were behind the resignation, which is to maintain Lebanon's neutrality.
Okay. Okay. So
overall, the mood is up. Yeah, overall, the mood is upbeat.
Okay. So upbeat for you, Bassem. You don't see it as a change of heart. Noor, I mean, is that a reasonable interpretation of events? What happened to everything that he said when he left? He said that Iran is taking over the country. Hezbollah is running the place on behalf of Iran. My life is under threat. I can't do this anymore. Suddenly, everything's okay. I don't understand what's going on. Tell me, Noor.
I mean, I think I have to disagree a little bit with Bassem here. And I think that, as you pointed out, everything that he said at the beginning that contributed towards his resignation, which is we need to cut Iran's hand, it's not safe for me to come back to Lebanon, has suddenly changed in the last 2 weeks. And since he came back yesterday, I mean, he was walking around in the public. He clearly didn't seem to fear for his life. So unless that threat has magically disappeared, I think it, again, brings suspicion onto the reasons what forced his very, very abrupt resignation. And I think we need to look at the larger picture, which is this was a game, or this was a move that Saudi made to try and pressure Lebanon. And it's a move that didn't work and backfired. So now we're seeing, the way that at least I've interpreted it, is that Lebanon has managed to succeed in maintaining its stability at this point, and Saudi's going to have to reassess how it wants to deal with Lebanon from now on. Okay, so Halim, is that how you see it? The Saudis gambled, and maybe Hariri was not in absolute control over his decisions, and the Saudi gamble backfired. Is that how you see it?
I mean, absolutely on one sense, but also a disclaimer in that we still till now haven't heard Prime Minister Hariri speak at length about what exactly happened to him on November 4 and subsequently for 2 weeks in Riyadh, where he was, you know, described in different words, but at least by the Lebanese president, it was said that he was detained in Saudi Arabia. And he said in his interview on November 12, he said that there are many secrets and he still has to discuss them with the president, but still for us as, you know, not members of his closest circle, we do not know exactly what happened. But having said that, I definitely agree a bit more with Noor in that this change of heart, as you termed it, was also caused by a rare display of national unity in Lebanon that basically had one voice coming out from Lebanon, except for a few fringe voices saying, we want Saad al-Hariri back. So regardless of whether Lebanese liked Saad al-Hariri or they didn't like him, whether they agreed with his politics or not, the unified, so to speak, official position was that we want Saad al-Hariri back. And there were a lot of diplomatic efforts employed by President Aoun and by Foreign Minister Gebran Bassil, who also, even for their political critics, there was kind of a consensus that they really managed to have a good crisis management, so to speak, to de-escalate the situation and to lead the country and maybe in one way to force Saudi Arabia to change its course. And as we well know, the Minister of State for Gulf Affairs, Al-Sabhan, who became a household name and was tweeting a lot of aggressive tweets against Lebanon, he has been missing in action since November, I think since 10 days now. So I think there has been a recognition from Saudi Arabia that they should de-escalate and that and at least their strategy failed and they have to work in a different direction now. So
Bassem, I mean, is your leader just a pawn in this game between Saudi and Iran? And that's the long and the short of it?
No, I don't think so. I must say that now there is an emphasis on security for Lebanon not to descend into any civil conflict. There is an emphasis on national unity, which your other guests have touched upon. And there's also an emphasis on dealing with a situation that has caused a lot of problems for Lebanon as a state, which is Hezbollah's interference in affairs outside Lebanon. And clearly the Prime Minister had spoken and addressed all these issues, that we are for security, we are for stability, But part of that also is to assert Lebanon's neutrality. And I think one can say with some confidence that the other party also realizes that, and already they've made some concessions in engaging in dialogue and expressing a new mood, which we noticed in the speech of Mr. Hassan Nasrallah about the willingness of Hezbollah to withdraw from Iraq, and now the situation in Syria is being resolved, and also to address the situation in Yemen. This is not totally an internal affair, and that issue in particular, Hezbollah's involvement in Yemen, is something that has to be dealt with at one point.
Right, yeah, and we'll have to ask the Saudis if they still believe that Lebanon has declared war on it, because times might have changed in a week and a half or so. But Noor, is the ball now in Hezbollah's court? What do they do now?
I think actually Bassem summed it up pretty nicely in that you have noticed that Hezbollah has offered some sort of concessions or compromise, and in the tone of Hassan Nasrallah's speeches and the fact that he, said that they'd finished in Iraq and that they'll withdraw from there, and that he made a long speech about how they weren't involved in Yemen, or how they weren't, like they had nothing to do with the ballistic missile that was shot. So this is part of Hezbollah's strategy to temper the situation and to show that they are open for dialogue with Hariri. They've the last 3 speeches of Nasrallah have been very calm and have been encouraging to come back to the table and to bring the Prime Minister back. So I actually think that this puts the ball back into Saudi's court, because I think Lebanon has once again been able to overcome this, obviously with a lot of help from outside. I mean, we can't forget what the French and the Egyptians have done to resolve this situation, right, or at least temper it down. But I think that Hezbollah is aware of the situation and is aware of how quickly things can escalate. But they're also aware of the fact that the Saudis are playing a very reckless game. And as this last episode has shown, it hasn't actually put Hezbollah on the back foot, but possibly made them stronger than what they wanted. So the Saudis really have to pay attention as to how they want to play the next round.
Halim, has Lebanese sovereignty been strengthened in the past few days?
Absolutely not, because I think it was strengthened in the display of national unity that President Aoun and President Hariri and President Birri showed on Independence Day, and calling for Hariri to be back. But let's step back for a second and see that basically we had our Prime Minister resign in a shock resignation from Riyadh on Saudi state TV. And then today, just to also complete the picture, we had the chief of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who came out with a statement saying that Hezbollah's weapons are not up for discussion. So from both sides, we see a continuous assault on our independence by basically these pronouncements in different ways, in different forms. Some people will argue that, Iranian interference is more than Saudi interference, and others will say that they're the same. I think that kind of loses the debate. The point is, our politicians in Lebanon still unfortunately listen to either Iran or Saudi Arabia, and there are very few parties who really have independence in the country. And having said that, I kind of also agree with what Bassem said, that yes, I did mention that Saudi Arabia had to kind of backtrack a bit from its strategy, but also I think he's right in mentioning that now there is a big need to discuss, a great need to discuss Hezbollah's status, whether in the country or outside the country, because of course, it seems that Saudi Arabia has lost this small round of the battle now, but we forget that the Arab League Foreign Ministers meeting had quite a harsh statement against Hezbollah, and even there were talks about putting sanctions on Lebanon. This didn't take place, especially with Egyptian response to Foreign Minister Basil's diplomatic efforts. But also, we shouldn't forget that there's this regional dimension, but there's also an international dimension of Donald Trump's administration taking a hard line against Iran and also taking a hard line against Hezbollah. And just to mention briefly, you have the US Congress's sanctions. Every week, every month, we hear of new sanctions that are targeting Hezbollah. So I think Hezbollah it is in its interest to actually listen to the concerns of the future movement and to listen to the concerns of Saudi Arabia and the Arab countries. But of course, always noting that these concerns should not be voiced in the way they were voiced as threats, as trying to isolate Hezbollah or trying to use external powers to kind of try to push for something internally. I think there is a need for dialogue, there is a need for honest dialogue that we are not used to in Lebanon.
Yeah, and that's something that the Prime Minister has been talking about. He's back for dialogue. His resignation has been deferred for the moment. We'll be watching this closely to see what happens next. I've got to wrap and move on. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Halim Shabaya, Noor Samaha and Bassem Shab. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead, Turkey, Russia and Iran take credit for saving Syria. Is a political solution to the war on the horizon? And we speak to Iraq's Vice President, Ayad Allawi. We'll ask what the future holds for his country after the defeat of Daesh. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. Leaders from Turkey, Russia and Iran met in Sochi this week to try and reach a peace deal for Syria. The war has raged on for 6.5 years, but there are hopes an end could actually be in sight. Moscow says its military operations will be wrapping up soon and that the conflict has now entered a new stage. Presidents Putin, Erdogan and Rouhani agree a political solution is on the horizon. Their answer, a Syrian People's Congress, where those involved in the conflict sit at the same table. But the list of invitees is still a sticking point. So, could these three nations really end the war? Shoaib Hassan reports.
These world leaders say they may have finally worked out a way to end what's so far been the bloodiest conflict of the 21st century. Syria's war has brought suffering to millions of people and caused repercussions far beyond the country's borders. Since the war began in 2011, nearly 500,000 people have been killed. That's largely due to airstrikes by Russian and Syrian regime jets, as well as suicide car bomb attacks and shelling by Daesh and the Nusra Front. The fighting has included the use of battle bombs and chemical weapons, banned by the Geneva Convention. And around 7 million people, more than a third of them children, have been made homeless and forced to flee the country. Almost half have been granted refuge in Turkey, while the rest have sought shelter across the world. The war has also destroyed Syrian infrastructure, causing the economy to lose $226 billion, resulting in massive food shortages. But the latest talks between Russia, Turkey and Iran appear to have struck one of the most positive notes yet of any peace talks on the conflict.
Можно с уверенностью констатировать, что мы подошли к новому этапу, открывающему возможность приступить к реальному политическому процессу урегулирования.
The presidents of Iran and Turkey echoed the comments, with the change in Ankara's previously skeptical view of the Russian-sponsored process being particularly striking.
Geldiğimiz nokta önemlidir ama yeterli değildir. Suriye halkının kabul edebileceği kalıcı ve muteber bir siyasi çözümün tesis edilmesi için ilgili Türk çevrelerin katkıyı sağlaması elzemdir.
The breakthrough was made 2 days after Putin met with Syria's Bashar al-Assad, whose forces currently have the upper hand in the war. That's only been achieved by backing from Russia and Iran, and they still appear keen to ensure their man stays in the game.
Today, there will be Putin's phone conversation with the King of Saudi Arabia, and one can certainly expect that Putin will of course inform his Saudi counterpart about yesterday's working visit to Sochi.
Riyadh has been holding a conference of Syrian opposition groups simultaneous to Sochi, which started with the resignation of Riyadh Hijab. He was the head of the opposition HNC, a faction that had ruled out talks with Bashar al-Assad under any circumstances. Hijab did not give any reasons for his resignation. But ahead of the main Geneva talks, it appears to clear the way for the Syrian opposition to become more cooperative, to something that was once unthinkable: the continuing role of Assad as head of the Syrian state. It's all happened with the tacit acknowledgement of the US as Russia moves to the role of the main arbiter of the conflict. It's left the West in the unexpected position of a bystander, and it's unclear how much of a role it will play in determining the future of Syria. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Bassam Barabandi. He's a former Syrian diplomat and the co-founder of the NGO People Demand Change. From Ankara, we have Temur Akhmetov. He's an analyst at the Russian International Affairs Council. And in Dubai, Monzer Akbek. He's the spokesman for Al-Ghad Party and a former member of the Syrian opposition coalition. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Bassam Barabandi, let me start with you. Talks in Sochi, we've had talks in Astana, talks in Riyadh. Geneva is not just a place anymore, it's an idea. What's the most encouraging thing to come out of all of that recently?
The most encouraging thing that comes, that nothing will happen. I know it's very, very well known that the Russian is investing heavily on the process of Sochi after Astana. And with the deal with the Americans, they make it clear that Geneva is the baseline for doing the negotiation. President Putin was clear in his statement saying that Sochi will come first, and at the end stages of Sochi will be Geneva or the UN involvement in Syrian crisis. The problem of Sochi, it has no clue what the Russians are hoping to do. They hope, or they claim, or that they can get all the Syrians together and accepting Bashar to be run for the elections and stay in the power without any real concessions. I see this difficult to achieve. The deal between Turkey, Russia, Iran doesn't build on the trust. It's built more on small tactical steps among these three countries to solve the Syria, to achieve their own interest. We don't know when this interest will diverge, when this interest will get together, overlap. Today, yesterday, it looks they are working together, but when we look about PYD, SDF, or the PKK involvement in Sochi, it will become problem. When we talk about the South Syria, where Hezbollah is existing,
certainly, Bassam, we've got two other guests.
Bigger problem that
certainly, we've got two other guests. I want to bring them in, and I'm sorry for interrupting you. Temur, are you as negative and skeptical as Bassam is about these talks, or do you believe that something truly good can come out of this?
First of all, I should urge you from not having too high expectations from the Sochi meeting. As we know, Russia repeatedly underlined that the Geneva process enjoys supremacy. And I think that we should view the Sochi mechanism and Astana talks as a preparation for the Geneva negotiations. And nowadays we should see actually Sochi talks as the trust-building measures, and there are still a lot of problems that should be solved by all sides. And Russia is doing exactly this by convening with Iran and Turkey that support different sides to the conflict.
Yeah, everybody wants a deal for different reasons. Monzer, let me put it to you this way. Many people like Bassam don't like the idea of any deal going ahead because they feel it means that Assad's future is off the table. Assad will stay in power, and the main player calling the shots, if it comes to a final resolution, is Assad's biggest backer, which is Vladimir Putin. That's why it leaves a bitter taste in their mouth and they refuse to accept it. Can you understand why they refuse to accept it? Because more than 350,000 people have been killed, and the people who are mostly responsible for the vast majority of those deaths are calling the shots when it comes to peace.
Well, this is speculative. Now, when you say that this process is not going to lead to anything and this process is going to lead to keep Bashar Assad in power, we cannot just determine that for sure. Now we know, everybody knows, that the solution in Syria is not a military one, it's a political. We have realized that since we were in the coalition and participated in Geneva early 2014. also when we did the Cairo conference 2015. And we realized also that the Russians are on the driver's seat in terms of the solution in Syria. So that's why we got engaged with them on early stage, got a lot of negotiations and talks with them, and actually they have told us about the idea of Sochi much earlier than when it was announced to the public.
Certainly.
And we found out that the idea itself, by getting all the groups of Syrians to agree on a new constitution that will allow them to end the civil war and move into peace and move into a political transition that is starting with a new constitution.
Okay, and I understand
this idea is somehow a valid idea that we were convinced with, and they are going to participate in it.
Okay, we've got two other people here. I want to come back to you in just a second, but I want to use as an example what Sergei Lavrov had to say about the resignation of Mr. Riyad Hijab, the head of the HNC. This is what Sergei Lavrov said. He said, the retreat of radically minded opposition figures from playing the main role will make it possible to unite this motley opposition, internal and external, on a more reasonable, realistic and constructive platform. We will support the efforts made by Saudi Arabia in this respect. So you have the head of the HNC, Riyad Hijab, essentially, Monzir, being smeared here by Mr. Lavrov. He sees him as radical, he sees him as extreme. So again, I ask you, if Mr. Lavrov is allowed to frame it in this way, that only the opposition that they deem valid are valid and everybody else is extreme, how can you have a proper solution going forward, Monzir?
Well, I don't agree for a foreign power to classify the opposition. This guy is good and this guy is bad. Of course, all Syrian oppositions, they are fighting for a just cause, which is the democratic transition in Syria, and Riyad Hijab is one of them. Now, on the other hand, also we have disagreed with the HNC when they have, for example, withdrawn from Geneva process back in 2016, last year, and we lost a year. And in this year, we have lost Aleppo, we have lost a lot of ground on the, and there was a huge violence, increasing violence at that time. We also disagree on what when they put a precondition to the negotiations, because the negotiations should take place with the regime itself. And the transition, the political transition, is a negotiated one with the regime. So when they say that the regime has to step down now, then who they are going to negotiate with? Now, all of us want Assad out of power.
So, Monzir, let's take that and
see Assad as a criminal dictator.
Good point. That's a good point.
We have to agree on the process, how we are going to get him out of power.
Let's take that and pose it to Bassam. Bassam, who are you going to talk to if Assad must step down first? Isn't that a good point? The whole point of negotiations is to talk with those you hate the most, right?
True. No, let's put things in real context. I agree with Mr. Monzir about the big picture, but I have big problem with the details that he mentioned. Number one, the UN Security Council 2254, it's explicitly said the steps that should go into negotiation. Russian, if they have the goodwill, they are the leading drive for the negotiation, that's true. If they are really serious in solving the way the Syrian people likes, the way they do Sochi, why don't they just empower Geneva process itself? As for the regime, the HNC or Riyad Hijab, as far as I know, he said we don't have precondition. The precondition is what the UN Security Council resolution, and we should not negotiate them. We should discuss and negotiate how to implement them. So there is a process. There is lines, clear lines. Where should we go forward? What should we negotiate with? And I don't think they said the regime should step down right now before the process, because otherwise the question would be valid if the regimes step aside with whom we will negotiate. The issue was the regime should not be part of the end solution. And the regime, Assad and his group, it's not about the institution of the government. So that's what make more doubts about what Russia is playing, what Russia wants, how to negotiate with the regime. that he killed all the people, and is that Russia want the Syrian people to accept the regime as de facto, as counterpart. We come back to Security Council Resolution 2254. It has steps, very clear steps. The elections, the people who will be elected in the transitional period, they will do the constitution, rather than what Russia wants, to start by the constitution, and then we go to the elections.
Understood.
So that's the bigger questions.
Yes,
so
and you made it quite
clear.
So
we know Russia has big play.
Yes.
Big role to play.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, but you don't want them to drive that process forward. Timur, looking at it geopolitically, is it clear right now, in late November 2017, that the US has a very small role to play, and that the real shapers of this conflict ending, if it does end, or whatever solution we have, are Mr. Putin, President Rouhani, President Erdogan? Those are the presidents who are shaping the end of this conflict, and not the Americans. Is that clear?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that it can be seen that the Astana and Sochi meetings are somehow drive U.S. out from the solving process. But to my mind, ultimately, Russia wants Americans to be a part of this process because they enjoy international control over the UN. And that's why ultimately Russia will try to engage U.S. as well. But for now, U.S. stays somehow aside from the process. But in the backdoor meetings, connections and ties, Russian officials are actively communicating with Americans. And it doesn't mean that Washington is somehow sidelined by Russia. For now, it seems that Russia is trying to engage, first of all, regional actors that primarily exert influence on the ground in Syria.
Okay, so Munzir, whether Washington is actively sidelined or not, or whether it's by design, Washington has a diminished role as we move forward. I mean, symbolically, visually, we're seeing other presidents at the forefront. They're hosting the peace conferences. They're trying to find active ways to extricate themselves out of it and find a solution. Is a diminished role from Washington, Munzir, helping or harming the situation?
Well, I don't believe that the Washington role is completely diminished. What I believe in is that the Russians has agreed with the Americans on a general paths or addresses, like, for example, fighting terrorism, a political solution as per Geneva Communiqué and Security Council Resolution 2254, ceasefire between the regime and moderate opposition. These are general things that they have agreed on. But for the details, I believe that the Americans, they have left for the Russians to set up all the details of those general ideas. Now, as we say that, we have realized that from early stage, and even when I was in the National Coalition, the American ambassador at that time, Mr. Robert Ford, he was always insisting that we should go and talk with the Russians, even in back in 2013. And we engaged with them. Last meeting we had with Mr. Lavrov was last month. And they are saying that they are committed to Geneva Communiqué as they have signed on it. They have committed to the Security Council resolution with the political transition, genuine political transition that leads to new constitution and free elections that is supervised by the United Nations, that all Syrians will participate inside Syria and outside Syria.
Right.
We have to put these statements into a testing. This means that they have their military, they have their veto in the Security Council. They have their army in Syria, that they have changed the whole military situation in Syria. And they are saying that they are with the Geneva Communiqué and political transition. We have to put this into test, and we have to engage with the Russian process as it is in order to see where it's going to lead. This doesn't mean that we are going to go to Sochi or to Moscow, and we're going to accept to let go our struggle for freedom and democracy.
Okay.
Not at all.
Good point. Good
We
point.
are going to take our fight for freedom and democracy, and we are going to put it there on the table, and we are going to put onto test what the Russians have signed off and what they have promised.
Okay. Let me ask you, Bassam, very finally. Out of Astana, came the de-escalation zones. All things considered, they have been a relative success. Things are quieter. Things are not perfect. Things are quieter. It was a terrible situation, and it's a bit quieter. Why don't you trust those who came up with the ideas of the de-escalation zones to take it further and maybe eventually achieve ultimate peace in your country?
Yeah, actually, this de-escalating zone as an idea I think, is good in short term. The three countries who agree on it, they agree on it on a specific zone in Syria and for short time. They said clearly it's for 6 months and it's renewed. If the three countries are really serious in achieving the stability and stopping the killing in Syria, they consider Syria altogether the escalating zone, except the ISIS and the Jabhat al-Nusra area, the terrorist groups. Otherwise, why to make some areas de-escalated and some area escalated? We saw the deal, let's say, the escalating zone in Ghouta, and we say how much the Russian and the regime are attacking Ghouta for the last 2 days. So what happens, the big picture is nice to say the escalating, the people are getting more aid, they're getting more stability or security, but in reality, the Russian and the regime and the Iranian, they are playing games where to move the powers, manpowers, to the area they needed. And the other areas, they say, okay, now we consider this de-escalated. So today, Ghouta is under attack, huge attack, violating all the de-escalating zone that have agreed on it. I believe the next step will be Daraa in the south. For any reason, the regime and the Iranian will go to the border with Israel and Jordan. So the de-escalating zone, it's good short term for the people to feel that they are have some kind of security. In long term, it's not serious thing. Otherwise, why don't make all Syria de-escalating zone, except the areas where they are fighting terrorists?
Okay, gentlemen, I've got to move on, but it's been great to talk to all of you.
Just to answer my friend,
I'm sorry, Bassam, I've got to jump in because I've got to move on. My sincere apologies, I've got to move on. But we'll have you again on the program. Okay. We'll be watching this story very closely and all the talks that are taking place in multiple cities. Bassam Barabandi, Timur Akhmetov, and Monzer Akbek. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.
From a military perspective, we have ended the presence of Daesh in Iraq, and Iraqis have the right to celebrate the day of victory over Daesh. So I am waiting for the final reports in order to declare the day of victory over Daesh.
Many in Iraq had hoped Saddam Hussein's fall in 2003 would mean positive change. But 15 years later, the country is still in a fragile state. It's been ravaged by war, a refugee crisis, sectarian strife, and of course, Daesh. In 2014, the terror group controlled much of Iraq's northwest, even taking the major city of Mosul. Now, Prime Minister Ayad Allawi says Daesh is almost defeated. Iraqi forces have launched a final operation to clear their remaining hideouts from the desert. But the country is still unstable. Despite holding elections, governing institutions remain weak. Corruption and poverty are still rampant. And a dispute with the Kurdish regional government still threatens to erupt. Well, to discuss all of this and more from Baghdad, we are joined now by Iraq's Vice President, Ayad Allawi. He's also served as the country's Prime Minister and President of the Iraqi Governing Council that came to power after the US invasion in 2003. Sir, it's a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers again. Iraqi forces have announced they're launching this major operation in the desert, on the western desert near the border with Syria. They want to flush out Daesh. Is this going to be the final battle with Daesh? After this, is Daesh going to be defeated in your country?
It depends what you mean by the final battle. If it's the military battle, I guess it should be one of the final military battles. But we are more interested in winning the war rather than the battles. And we are more interested in winning the peace, not only the war against extremism and ISIS. So we need really to be careful not to have the same environment prevails, which is hospitable and in favor of radicalism and extremism. This is what I think is peace, and this is what I think is winning the war.
Given that atrocities have been documented in the fight against Daesh in this military battle, especially with regards to the fight for Mosul, are you afraid that a version of Daesh or something even worse will rise up again and history will repeat itself?
Absolutely, absolutely. This is what we are frightened of. We know for sure that there are still sleeping cells here and there. And it depends, these sleeping cells could flourish, could expand, could get bigger if the environment, social, political, and economical environment is not adjusted to become non-hospitable to the, hostile to the extreme forces and hostile to terrorism. We see that there are now, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of displaced people are still displaced. Some people are not allowed to return to their homes, not only in Mosul, but elsewhere in the belt of Baghdad and the Ala province and elsewhere. Sectarianism still prevails, and we think and believe, and I definitely think and believe that if we don't adjust the environment, this environment, and make it, and adjust the political process to become an inclusive political process, then there is a great risk that ISIS would return to us in probably a different form, a more radical form, a more vicious form, as we have ended Al-Qaeda before, and Daesh came after Al-Qaeda. My fear is if we don't win the peace in Iraq and in the region, then it is very likely that extremism would rise again in this part of the world.
At the beginning of 2016, I asked you if Iraq is now a client state of Iran, and you said you were worried because it feels as if it's becoming one. So 22 months on, let me ask you directly, is Iraq now a client state of Iran?
I wouldn't say client, but I think and believe and know that the influence of Iran is too great in Iraq still. It's too great in Iraq, and if the trend continues as is, then unfortunately will become dominated completely by neighboring countries, of course, most importantly Iran. That's why I believe that Iraq needs to rise in a unified way. We need to have an inclusive political process. We need to get out and away of sectarianism, and we need to have the arms all within the state of Iraq, within the army, and with the security, official security instruments. This will lead ultimately changing Iraq into a kind of a citizenship state, a state that everybody has the equal rights in this country, every Iraqi, each Iraqi. This is the only way really to combat terrorism and to combat extremism. Without this, we will be a client probably to a lot of countries, unfortunately. But definitely Iran still has a very major say in Iraq and the issues of Iraq, not only Iraq, but rather the region also.
Right. Yeah.
And this can pose a grave danger for this country.
Don't you have some sympathy for Prime Minister Ayad Allawi, given that he has been accused of being a puppet of Iran? You were accused many years ago during the US occupation of being a puppet of the US. Now, from his perspective, perhaps just like from your perspective back then, there's a power that you need and you have favorable policies towards that you need in order to stabilize your country. So maybe from his perspective as Prime Minister, he just needs the Iranians, just like you needed the Americans, to help put out fires in your country, no more, no less.
I did not need the Americans. I was against the war. I was against the occupation. I was all for sovereign Iraq. And this is all present in our statements before the war and after the war, and in the formation of the governing council. I never was a puppet to Iran. I never was elected as a prime minister by America. In fact, the Americans wanted me to become the Minister of Defense. But I told them, this is not your business, it's the business of the governing council. And the governing council should elect the prime minister, the president, and the ministers in Iraq.
Okay.
So I am not a puppet. The Iraqis sees me as not a client for anyone. And in fact, I enjoy a very good reputation inside and outside Iraq. When I talk about Iran, I don't say that it is necessary for stabilizing the country. It is dominating the decision-making process in Iraq, and this is the danger. In 2010, I won the elections, but yet Iran refused to acknowledge this, and they decided to confiscate the will of the Iraqi people and choosing another prime minister. And this is what happened exactly. So really we are talking about who is going to confiscate the will of the Iraqi people, who is going to confiscate the final political decision, the sovereign political decision of the Iraqis. This is what I stand for.
Understood.
This is what I believe in. And really, America, although occupied Iraq, but they ultimately gave up to the governing council, and they gave the power to the governing council to elect the government that the governing council sees fit and can run the country. And the governing council unanimously elected me as the prime minister, elected the president of Iraq then, and also suggested the ministers, and I picked some of the ones who were suggested as ministers to fill the various portfolios. So really there is no comparison here.
Okay.
And I am not accusing the AlAbadi as a puppet to Iran.
Certainly, that's a strong defense.
Let me just finish this.
Certainly.
I am not accusing AlAbadi as being a puppet to Iran, but I think AlAbadi is not managing well the balancing factor where we have to gain and continue a friendship with Iran and Turkey and the other neighboring countries, and between the Iraqi sovereign decisions, political decisions, as where Iraq is going, where Iraq should be heading, and how we can achieve. And if we take the most recent example of this, we see Qasem Soleimani in Kirkuk and regaining Kirkuk to the government of Iraq. It's not acceptable. We don't have a lack or a deficiency in leaders and military leaders and military army. But this was something which is unacceptable from our point of view in Iraq, as the war itself and as the occupation was not acceptable to us.
Right. Let me ask you.
This is well documented, by the way.
Okay.
Even in Turkey, with the Turkish government, this is well documented.
Okay, fair enough. I want to ask you about the north. We are running out of time, so this will be my final question to you. But we've seen the Iraqi government very staunchly defend its sovereignty. It's had a lot of allies in putting down the aspirations of those who had the referendum, the KRG referendum. So they pushed back quite vehemently. Was it the right thing to do, or will it just defer the problem to later on, given that the Iraqi army went in with some tanks, the Iraqi government seized some key parts of Kirkuk, it had some help from Iran? Is the problem just being kicked down the road for later on when it might be bigger?
No, it's not some help. It is really an issue that should be dealt by Iraqis with Iraqis. The Kurdish population is part of the Iraqi society, and the sovereignty of the government of Iraq should be on all its lands, from Zakho to Fao in the south, from the east and west. and I think there was some, the government has right to regain the control over all Iraq, and this is important, but it should have been done in a different way, and it still has to be done in a different way. We have to embrace the Kurdistan region and the Kurdish people into our overall Iraq, and have them as part and parcel of the Iraqi society. Whether we like it or not, they have been part of the Iraqi society. There are some who have aspirations. This is there is no wrong thing in doing so, but to preserve the unity of Iraq is very sacred, very important, and this is what the government tried to achieve. But unfortunately, it didn't give Mr. Barzani, a decent way out of this mess. Now, my fear really, if we don't rectify the issue with the Kurds and get them involved more within the political process in Iraq, my fear is that Kurdistan will become a haven, a safe haven for extremists and those who are against the political process. And we don't want anybody to harbor any grudge against the political process or against the unity of Iraq. And this is what we should be looking at and doing with our friends and the brothers, the Kurds, without interferences and the statements coming from left and right and center. This is unacceptable. It's unacceptable that any country, whether Iran or Turkey or Saudi Arabia or anybody else around Iraq, interfere in Iraqi matters. I told the Turkish government that we need to resolve the issue of the presence of the Turkish army inside Iraq by assuring Turkey that we are not going to allow Iraq to be used against Turkey, and secondly, by getting Turkey to agree that the Iraqis should make the decision whether their units, army units, should stay or remain or not remain in Iraq. And we agreed on this with the Prime Minister of Turkey when he visited Baghdad. And I also discussed this with ex-President Gül when I saw him in Amman on the fringes of the security meeting in Amman. So I think we should deal inclusively to maintain the inclusivity of the political process where each and every Iraqi should be respected, regardless, except those who are extremes and who are terrorists. That's all.
Right.
Otherwise, we should incorporate everybody in an inclusive way.
Okay, unfortunately, I've got to move on. Iraq's Vice President Ayad Allawi. Sir, it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers again. Thank you very much for joining us. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.